All right, so I've just introduced the harm principle and the desert constraint, and now I want to ask some of the detailed questions that you might be wondering about. Let's start with the harm principle. Some people think that the harm principle, as well motivated and nice sounding as it is from a liberal point of view, it isn't really that much of a limit on criminalization in practice. And the reason is that some of the concepts it uses are kind of mushy, especially the notion of harm and the harmfulness of an action, which illiberal legislatures might try to exploit to expand the criminal law potentially without limit. So let's take a look at the questions giving rise to that kind of skepticism about the practical utility of the harm principle. First big question, what is harm? Okay, starting point, concrete and tangible harms obviously are sufficient to satisfy the harm principle. So for example, if your conduct causes physical harm to someone's body, broken bones, or death, that's going to be enough for the conduct to be criminalized under the harm principle. Similarly, psychological harm, right? So pain and suffering and anguish and fear of physical harm and diagnosable trauma or lasting psychological damage, if your conduct causes that type of harm, that's also a kind of clear type of harm that satisfies the harm principle. And if your conduct causes it, the harm principle is no bar to criminalizing that conduct. Likewise for harm to property rights, so loss of money, losses of property, things you own, damage to property you own, those kinds of harm, if your conduct causes it, like with theft, that's a basis for criminalization under the harm principle as well. The harm principle will not bar criminalization of that type of conduct that damages property rights as well. So physical harm, psychological harm, and tangible harm, if your conduct causes that, those are the easy cases of what it takes to satisfy the harm principle. But what else? Where are the limits? Are merely offensive words harm, like vulgar statements or insults or taunting or other disrespectful words that don't cause physical or psychological damage? It's been much debated, and some words like threats to harm or encouraging others to cause harm, those clearly can be deemed sufficiently harmful to be criminalized under the harm principle. But the traditional liberal view, the traditional view of the criminal law in a free society, is that in a free society, merely offensive words that don't threaten or risk harm or encourage physical or psychological harm are not going to be sufficiently tangible harms to satisfy the harm principle. So mere offensive statements without more is not going to be enough to satisfy the harm principle on the traditional picture. Similarly, for words or actions like holding signs or protests that criticize or disrespect the government or prominent people, right? Statements like that might well show some alienation to or even hostility to the current legal order, but they're not normally going to be sufficiently harmful in tangible enough ways to count as satisfying the harm principle. So brackets, you can imagine an authoritarian government making it a crime to criticize the government in public, say at a protest or online. They might argue that this violates the civic order, our essential sense of ourselves, or the stability of society. But these kinds of sweeping claims, at least unless there is a particular threat or scientifically convincing empirical basis for them, they shouldn't be accepted in a free society. A truly free society, this is my view, this is what I think, but a lot of people share this view in the liberal criminal law tradition. A truly free society can withstand, actually, a large degree of alienation from and criticism of and even mocking of the government and its policies. We can take it. In a free society, we have a duty to hold leaders to account through rational scrutiny and public criticism to ensure that they continue to serve all of us. So some things don't count as harms on a traditional view of the criminal law in a free society, but it's true that this is going to be one of the debatable points, and those in favor of expansive uses of the criminal law are going to be tempted to claim that this or that conduct that they want to criminalize is harmful. And they might make that claim in a very expansive or perhaps even exaggerated way about what harms we're talking about. So be on the lookout.